All right, we'll start with introductions. Let's go around. Eric, do you want to start?
Yes, Eric Munson, Transportation Inspector.
Thank you. Forrest Dunbar.
John Weddleton.
Suzanne France.
Pete Peterson.
Jim Gates, City Council.
Can we go through and have people introduce themselves, please?
Raymond Corolla.
And say who you're with, if you don't mind.
With Yoda.
Orlando Torralba, Yellow Cab.
Michael Thompson, Checker County.
Barbara Jones, municipal clerk.
Mike Abbott, city manager.
Lisa Slusa, deputy clerk.
In the back, please.
Marina Juan,
Okay.
Public Transportation Director.
Susie Smith.
Okay. Thank you. Well, this is going to be a short meeting. We just have 30 minutes, and then we've got another hearing after this. So we're going to go through pretty quickly. I think, based on some conversations we've had, we're going to have another transportation committee meeting next month, and probably have a little bit more of a full agenda. But for this time, I'm just going to ask that the transportation inspector and Mr. Gates sort of describe to us what has been happening with AO 124S, which we passed last year, and then also a little bit of an update on HB 132, which just recently passed, that dealt with TNC. So, Eric, would you mind starting and speaking a little bit about 124?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, the Assembly passed 124 last December, and its implementation was delayed pending results of the municipal election in April. And so, that ordinance, of course, mandated the issuance of a certain number of permits, 20 permits per year over a 5-year period. And some other items to increase access in the taxi market. After the delay from the election, the first series of 20 permits went to auction, and that concluded on May 10th. For 2017, there were 15 general permits in the offering and 5 disability service permits. The 15 permits left without any problems. There were some hiccups with the disability permits because there were dual bidders. Several of those that chose to bid on a general permit also bid on a disability permit. And what was happening as the results were being opened and the bids were being opening, those bidders of the disability permits were withdrawing their bids. And so as it was apparent, they were going to become the winner of a general use permit. So when all the dust settled, it went through just 3 of the 5 available disability service permits were awarded. The nominal bids, or the median price on the general permit, was just over $19,000. The high was $34,000, and then the remaining 2 low ones were let at $11,000. Of the disability permits, it was very minimal. That was about 2,700. It was just over what the annual permit fee was. The 2 remaining permits are just going to roll and be included in the next bid offering, which will be the 2018 bid offering, and that will be at some point per the ordinance later this year. The commission will set that date, the near-term upcoming meeting for those. So,
Eric, with regard to disability permits, do you see some way to avoid this happening again, the same thing happening next year? Do you think we'll get the same kind of process where people will bid on both and then drop their bid on a disability?
Well, the issue of disability permits themselves has long been controversial. This time the ordinance passed in December had some additional mandates imposed on them, such as operating from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, during the times of substantial need and most need. many of the operators and the bidders on those particular ones felt that the municipality was sort of diving too deep into mandating how those operate. And so there was less overall enthusiasm about those. Whether that will transcend into the next offering, which of course would be 7, I'm uncertain because the full parameters and impacts of that now are being weighed.
Mr. Peterson, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering why in the world would anyone buy a taxi permit when they can see that the legislature is about ready to allow Lyft and TNC companies to come operate in the state of Alaska?
Well, through the chair, that's a very broad question, Mr. Peterson, but I can tell you we have some limited data available from 2014 when the TNC, full charge entered our market and prior to withdrawing, and the impact was in some respects less severe than some might have anticipated, and then in some respects it was more severe. It all depended on it. But we were tracking that. Of the 6 months they operated, the apparent hit or negative impact in the tax was around 23%. It's easy, people love the technology, and it's the technology, and the cabs are going to have to adapt to that technology. But it's also important to know when you get caught up in the hubbub of it is we're not like any major city in the lower 48 that has a road network that spans from multi-city to multi-city. Even Anchorage, we're in a bowl, we're surrounded by mountains and the sea. And so outside of our summer tourist season, we have a limited market. And I think with the full implementation of the recently passed ordinance, even with the entrance of the TNCs into our community, all the safety issues aside, I think in 18 to 24 months, it's really going to shake itself out and settle down. I think by then, the dispatch companies, the cab companies will have upgraded and modernized their equipment to be in a much more competitive environment. And it will be localized. So all of that, all of that localizability will be there. Unfortunately, and to the benefit of the TNCs, is that app is global. The taxi industry evolved over 100 years as franchises. A yellow cab company was a franchise. So there are efforts being made by some technological companies to find ways to integrate like Yellow Cab around the country, where if there is more broad-based use of that app, it will know, this is like Yellow Cab Anchorage, and this is even driver 8525, and it will know if it's an app-based billing how to bill it so that it goes to the right people. That's a way off. But we'll see.
So I'd just like to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Trainee and Mr. Croft. Mr. Gates, you had a question or a point?
I wanted to add to Mr. Whistler's response to Mr. Peterson's question about why someone would want to tax capital, even after TNCs have been authorized. And as we get to the state law soon, I just want to point out, even though TNCs are coming to us, the market's going to be changing really fast. But we're still going to be a market legally for taxi cabs, because state law doesn't allow TNCs or requires the roads onto the transportation. That's the not by telephone calls or some other means. And it prohibits cash payments for fares. So taxi cabs can still accept cash payments, TNCs cannot. And it prohibits street handlers. So taxi cabs still have use other avenues that TNCs would not allow to use for private transportation service. So there's still a market for
So, Mr. Musser, in addition, 124 did some other things in addition to letting more permits. So can you give us any updates on those other provisions in 124 that are now in effect?
Well, the chief other provision was the authorization of a nonprofit to come in and operate what was classified as a fleet permit. It's a very new concept that seeks to address some of the concerns associated with services visibility. We've had meetings with just two entities, Hope and Rural Cap as the large one. We're data mining and we're going to reach out to every nonprofit. We're in the process of doing that. Really to emphasize both the concept and the availability. Even of the two entities we reached out to, there were concerns of the capital costs associated with implementing that. As we know, even the state grants really have gone to anchorites here within Anchorage. And, I think in the upcoming fiscal budget statewide, the statewide community resource allocations may rent for just 5 vehicles. So it's going to take a lot of work. It remains a top priority for us to work and implement that section and make it a reality to offset some of these issues.
Could you talk a little bit about who bought the 15 general permits? What they're kind of, are you allowed to do that? Are you allowed to tell us who bought them?
So yeah, it's public information. Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. So of the 15 general permits that were issued, all but one were already existing chauffeurs that had been either leasing a permit from a permit owner and operating that permit, or were just leasing a cab on a daily rate. One father-son duo acquired successfully 2 permits. It was pretty diverse. The Korean community was well represented, acquiring 4 permits. The Hispanic community also was kind of split almost equally between, the Korean community, the Hispanic community, and then the Somali community. The combined experience of many, many years of these operators that acquired with permits.
So I think I'm going to move on to HB 132 unless there are any more questions about 124 and its implementation. I mean, I guess the last question is, has anything gone I guess the issue with the disability permits was unanticipated, but has anything else sort of gone wrong or gone not as we anticipated as we've been implementing 124?
Mr. Chairman, no, sir. Everything went pretty smoothly. We just had the delay. Purchasing really did a very good job of simplifying that process and getting it out there. And we just don't expect any really complicated issues even with the next office.
Mr. Weldon?
Do you know which of the dispatchers they went to?
As of this morning, only 8 of those permits are on the road, and 6, in an interesting bit of irony, 6 have gone to Yellow Cab and 2 have gone to Checker Cab.
All right. Well, let's move on. So HB 132. Eric, are you going to start talking about that, or is Dean?
Through the chair, but I'll refer that to Dean. Now, it's pretty straightforward, though, but I think we can resolve that.
Sure, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Musser, if you intervened, I think there is some really good reasons. So, okay. So with HB 132, the state passed it passed the House on May 13th, it passed the Senate on May 17th. It's waiting to transmit to the governor now. And I had some background in the bill, but I think it might be more efficient with our time. If go to the highlights of what this bill does, and those numbers that I can wonder about. So the highlights of this bill are the main ones. It sets up new chapter 28 in the Alaska State Statutes titled the Transportation Network Companies Act. And you have the bill with the report which you had a copy on page section 6 of that. And it's got a whole bunch of provisions that I'll go through below there, highlights. And that bill really needed to address two things in state law. One was insurance provided for teens and transportation. It was a big issue nationwide. States addressed that, and this bill addresses that for us. It doesn't require insurance companies to, it says insurance companies can exclude coverage and/or personal automobile insurance policy for drivers that are logged in or providing rides. So it's not forcing insurance companies to provide coverage. And then in the section, the new chapter, it allows insurance, it outlines the insurance requirements for providing P&C insurance for vehicles. And it's listed in 2 periods. While logged on to the app or ready rides, and then while engaged in prearranged drive, which includes after everybody rides. We pick up passenger lanes when you drop passengers off. So now insurance companies who are licensed on surface line insurance, that type of insurance. So never had
Mr. Trainee had a question.
Dave, this preempts the city, doesn't it? Any control on
yeah,
TNCs at
I
all?
mean, that's my 4th point in my highlights. So
But it does preempt it.
yeah, sure.
Okay. Because at some point in time, we have people calling, complaining about TNCs to us. And you just gotta tell them, call your state legislature because we have no control over TNCs.
Seems like a fair response to me. So the third highlight I was going to point out is it excludes P&C drivers from the workers' compensation law. That was a big issue while they did a lot of operating with us. So we addressed that. And the fourth highlight I was going to point out is the preemption. So the act of the bill prohibits for municipalities not to be otherwise than is provided in section 29.5. It says the authority to regulate transportation network companies and drivers is reserved to the state, and except as specifically provided by statute, the municipality may not enact or enforce an ordinance regulating transportation network companies or transportation network company drivers. Towards the end, there was up for passage, there was an amendment to review prohibition on regulating drivers, and that took fact that it's in there now in the final version. So we're not able to regulate the companies or the drivers. It's savvy on the vehicles, and I don't know if that's all inclusive though, the transportation network type of service. And this is what's called an express preemption. It's not implied, and it doesn't say that the municipality cannot be inconsistent with it. It says it's reserved for the state, municipalities can't regulate it all. So it's pretty strongest free from preemption language that the state can probably enact. The prohibition though, there's a couple of exclusions. It does not include sales taxes that are levied in the same manner that other services are taxed in municipality. And the language is important because in Anchorage, we don't tax any other services. So we don't tax other services. We can't tax transportation services. We do have some goods and sales. We have bed tax, motor vehicle rental tax, tobacco tax, and marijuana tax. So I don't think any of those would be considered a tax on services. But that's why I think if we were to consider sales tax just on services, we would have to be taxing some other services as well. So, and that was mostly, I think, to accommodate sales taxes that many of the municipalities in Alaska have, such as Juneau and the second exclusion from the prohibition is that a municipality owns all traffic ordinances, so you still have to comply with all traffic laws. So that's no surprise, and it's our Title 94 code. They want to comply with roundabouts and stuff.
So can I ask a question? Of course. And this is I just want to hammer this point because I think it's going to be one of the main points of contention with us in the state. According to your interpretation of this document, is there any way we can impose any kind of fee or a service charge? It sounds like the only way we could do that is to have a general sales tax for all Anchorage on all services. Is that right?
I wouldn't want to commit to saying it's the only way, but it seems the most likely way to be could. I suppose we have categories of taxes, but I would want to research that much more. A category that would encompass transportation resources and other sources as well. The new types of other sources.
Mr. Peterson, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I believe we require current taxi cabs to be inspected regularly, and there is a fee involved with that inspection if I'm not incorrect. And are we allowed under this bill to inspect the TNC vehicles? Or are we just taking the word of the company that, oh, it'll be just fine? I mean, that doesn't always work out.
Well, the preemption language is very strong. Although it didn't say vehicles, the transportation of the companies in the speed chapter inspection that have a vehicle inspection. And if we wanted to inspect vehicles, then we would have to find ourselves facing the arguments that no, it's all provided stuff municipalities can't. I guess one feature of the state, and the bill on page 11, the new section 28.3 the transportation that the company vehicles. So this is part of the state's regulation of TNCs. And I'm going to say, when they mention vehicles of preemption, they would have vehicles here in TNC services. I think that's a really tough argument to make. So I would say, most likely, no, we couldn't. But one feature here of the section that I pointed to, I think the list of items to inspect seems very similar to what is in our call for inspection of taxi cabs and other vehicles. But it only says before a personal vehicle being used to provide TNC services. It doesn't say anything about periodic or regular inspections, so every year or 2 years or so forth. We had every 2 years in our ordinance. And this just says before you can use the vehicle, it doesn't say otherwise. Regular inspections.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Trainee, then, do you have a question for John? Mr. Trainee, then Mr. Weldon.
Mr. Peterson, reading this, the state's preempt this, much like alcohol and marijuana. They're going to have to set up a whole agency to regulate TNCs and a finding structure. My only question is, to say that, I wonder if they're actually going to appropriate money to do it. Because if they're preempting us from everything, that means we can't check the cars for safety equipment. We can't check the criminal records of the drivers. The state's going to be 100% responsible for doing that.
We're going to have to take their word.
And they're about $3.5 billion in debt right now.
I mean, they did such a good job with snow removals, yeah. Mr. Weldon?
Dean, is there, we're allowed to regulate them through municipal traffic ordinance? Is it possible to have a requirement in Title IX, I guess that is, that says vehicles for hire have to have inspections annually?
I would like to look into that further. It sounds like a creative way a creative idea to get around preemption language here. But I would like to look into that further.
Sure. Yeah, Mr. Mustard.
Through the chair, to further respond to that, the legislation went so far as to very clearly state that a TNC vehicle is not a vehicle for hire, not a taxi, and not any other operational vehicle. To answer that question.
Well, respond. We could use another word. I mean, maybe we put in there Title IX, TNCs must be inspected annually, something, whatever word you choose.
Maybe TNCs are to not be violating traffic code, they have to have a certain kind of decal they can only get from the city. If you get the decal, they have to do X. Has anything, you know what, we're running out of time, but I think it's going to be an ongoing issue we could talk to, we could think about what other cities have done too. Mr. Abbott, do you have anything, or the administration have anything more to add on this?
No, we're available to work with the assembly on answering some of these questions. The mayor has some of the same concerns I hear you all discussing today. We're open to suggestions on where the state legislation might leave the municipality an option to provide some level of reasonable regulation of the TNCs.
Is the mayor, I guess, I don't know if you want to speak to him, but for him rather, but is the administration open to working with us in our legislative committee to make this potentially one of our policy asks this year, to go back and perhaps change this in some way?
Potentially. We haven't talked about the 2018 legislative program yet.
Okay. So we only, do you have some?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think you feel the frustration. I'll just express it briefly that a legislative body that complains a lot about federal overreach, about federal preemption, about federal interference, and then acts in this way to preempt when we not only had a robust process, I believe reached a better result, but at least a result that was thought out and discussed, and had a public vote on it. To do this expansive preemption language is really irritating, to say the least, and to say one more is, I think, an arrogance of office that is not unique to them, but when you substitute judgment for your judgment for somebody at a lower level, closer, I think, to the people, you ought to do it very rarely or almost not at all. And so this is troubling. That's as broad a preemption language. They have the power to do it, and I think they implemented it as broadly a way. Rather than asking pretty please if we can't do little regulation, or I think we ought to accept that they have. And what I propose is that we repeal our ordinance and let them do what they have the power to do, should not, but make it very clear, it's your ball. You took the ball, it's your ball.
Well, this is something I want to talk about going forward, but my inclination is to not repeal our ordinance, but sort of to leave it there and leave it dormant. So we don't have, because I agree with you, I thought we did a pretty good job, and I would rather avoid going through that fight again if this happened. But I think that's something we'll continue to talk about in the coming months. Mr. Welton?
Well, I guess that is the question. What is the status of our
Dead letter.
Yeah.
I mean, Dean, you agree with that, right? Our ordinance is dead letter.
We're not going to actually enforce it, so it's pretty much dead.
I really strongly feel we should get rid of it. We can talk that more, but keeping something that is unenforceable on the books, because maybe sometime they might change their mind. It's sick.
So we only have a couple more minutes. I'd like to, if anyone from the public would like to speak. Yes, Barbara?
Actually, your meeting was till 12:30, and the ZCO work session is at 12:30, so you can have a couple of minutes, but I just want to make sure that...
Is Zico, is he here?
Yes, they are waiting in your hall.
Well, we'll do one then. Go ahead. Please identify yourself to the record and keep it to just 2 minutes.
Kevin Rustin, driver, not an owner of Med. I thank you for allowing me the time to speak. I will be brief, and I hope I do not ramble. I had the pleasure about 25 years ago of going up to, I believe it was Trinity Presbyterian Church. They had a seminar on Holocaust survivors. They had a gentleman who had survived the Holocaust, and they also had a rescuer. He mentioned a word in there when somebody had asked a question, why did you not leave? And he said this word in Yiddish, Arisayom. And I grew up in New York, and I used to deliver a Yiddish newspaper when I was a kid. So I certainly hadn't heard that word since I was living up here. And it was about the Aryanization of businesses, that to get Jewish people to leave, they basically confiscated the property that they had. But they wanted to make this fiction of legality about the way they did it. And that was the way they did it. And this man's parents ended up like the business that they were forced to sell for pennies on the dollar, who would then even be put in a blocked account that they wouldn't have access to. But they stuck around, even though they knew things were getting bad, because they thought, like, one day things will change. I'll get my money. Needless to say, that didn't happen. I am going to point out another fact, too, that's probably not lost on people here, is that a lot of the drivers here of Albanian heritage, owners and operators, who worked hard, came to the country. A lot of them came from, not only Albania, but the former Yugoslavia, Macedonia. Out of all the countries in Europe, and this is something I know because I grew up in Europe, out of all the countries in Europe, the only country that had more Jews in it after the war than before the war was Albania. They saved their neighbors. I don't know, I'm not doing anything brave today, but I know this. To go up to Nazis and say, can we have our neighbors back? Took a lot of bravery. They lived by a code of honor. It's called Besa, and it translates as, very appropriate here, to keep your word. That when they put their protection under the people, that they took care of them. The risk not only to themselves, but all their family members, and they took that risk. And those are the same people now that unfortunately are going through the process of watching their wealth that they worked for and worked hard for to be confiscated from them. I know the actions of the people here. I do not doubt that they want to see improved service in this city regarding this issue. I have no doubt about it. And I see that you talk about, okay, Mr. Croft, the seriousness that you take, that the state preempting any rules that you might have at this level. But they have lost the mandate of heaven as far as I'm concerned. And I am going to recommend, not only because of what they're doing to the drivers and the owners here, but also to the Native Corporation that made the investment in their community. The promise of ANCSA was that economic stimulation. The claims that they would give up would be in exchange for them. They invested in this community, in that dispatch company. And now it's going to be worthless.
Kevin,
That area, I know, I'm sorry, that area, Casilda, where they're from, Hooper Bay, it's the poorest area in the United States. Our highest unemployment in the nation, not just one state, highest in the nation.
Kevin, I'm sorry, we have to move on to the next topic.
Thank you
for your time. Thank you, everyone. This hearing is adjourned.